So creating edible ecosystems, gardening like the forest. What's that about? Well, what I want to do tonight is a lot, actually. I'm going to do my best to pace this well, but I do have a lot that I want to share, and I'm trying to give you a pretty big package of information and ideas. But it's the totality that's most important here. So what I want to do is start by framing a big picture view of what ecosystem mimicry is and what it does, because that's really what permaculture is about for me. And I want to engage with some core topics in edible ecosystem design in terms of goals and some concepts and some examples. I want to really focus on ecosystem social structure and especially guilds and polycultures. And I'm hoping that all this will inspire some further experimentation and research. And despite, I'm going to slightly step aside from what Josh said, because yes, I do have a fair amount of experience, but a lot of these two books that I have over here, represent 8 years of research and writing and consolidation of my life experience. But it's also really looking at what does the science of ecology have to teach us about how we do agriculture, and how can we embody that in our own gardens. And it's basically one big fat theory. It's like really full of a lot of solid research, but very few people have actually taken all these ideas and put them all together and tried to apply them in the way that I'm going to talk about. So it really comes down to us working out what actually works of these theories. And, a lot of people are working on it. The books came out in 2005. We're learning some. There's a lot of good stuff happening up at DAcres, and I'm sure plenty of mistakes. I encourage us all to make as many mistakes as possible, as fast as possible. All right? I think it's going to take about 200 years for the field that I'm going to focus on tonight to really come to maturity. I wish I could live to see that. But we have to begin that, and we have to begin in a lot of different ways. So, anyway. So it's a little bit of a doorway here. But I want to start by looking at the big picture, and my understanding is this used to be rainforest. Okay, this is the military model for agriculture, which is basically running agriculture in the world. And it's basically a doomed system, a doomed model, because it depends entirely on fossil energy. Enough said? All right, here's one of my favorite quotes. It says, "Not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." That is the definition of fitness, folks. Not the social Darwinist thing about the strongest surviving. It's the most responsive to change. So why do you think I had us breathe for a few moments at the beginning of my talk? Because I want us to be present right here, right now. Because if we're not present, we can't respond to change. If we're not here, if we're responding to the past or we're way in the future, we're not here to respond to what's actually going on in the world in this moment. If we don't respond to change, we're not going to survive. Industrial agriculture is doomed. All right? So, what we're about to talk about here occurs with David Holmgren, one of the co-founders of permaculture, and he talked about how we have this, no particular time frame here. It's a fuzzy time frame, but you've got, this slow growth of population and energy and resource use and pollution and waste production, but exponential growth. We could look at the situation we've got in the world, climate chaos and the mass extinction that's begun now because of our behavior, and population crisis, and all these other different things, and look at them all as separate problems, but they're all actually part of the same dynamic of our species going through this behavior right here. All of that is part of this image right here. And where do we go from here? Well, David Holmgren says we have basically 4 scenarios. we've got the growth tech scenario. I've renamed a bunch of these. The growth tech scenario believes that we can continue growing ad infinitum on a finite planet. Well, maybe we can grow onto Mars or the Moon or whatever, you know. Probably not very realistic, and you know, cold fusion will save us, right? Then we've got the green tech stability model, which is basically what Europe is shooting for. They're trying to maintain a high standard of living, a high population concentration, but they're buying into green energy big time. I mean, they're shutting down nuclear plants over there. Thank God. They're smart. Smarter than the U.S. is right now. Shutting down nukes. You know, Fukushima, hello. Things at Fukushima, by the way, are really worse. They're getting worse. They're not getting better. If there's another earthquake over there, if building number 4 collapses, then it's game over, folks. Because there's plutonium stored in the top of that building that's enough to wipe out all of us easily, right? So this is not being paid attention to. And I kind of hate to bring it up, but it's like we've got to respond to what the reality is. Okay? So green tech stability, you know, they're shooting for that. Good luck. Europe is dependent on food from Africa and all over the Mediterranean and South America, and I don't know how they're going to make it with the population they've got there. But I support them to go for that. Then we've got the lifeboat scenario, not our favorite thing to talk about. Some people enjoy talking about it. I'm not a fan of this scenario. I do fear it. And so I try to live with that in mind. But then we have this last one, regenerative descent, is what I call it. We're trying to regenerate the planet while we reduce our energy use, our population, our resource use, our pollution and waste production. And that decline from the cultural ears of people who've grown up in a culture of growth is good, recession's bad, not growth is bad, growth, decline sounds bad. We think of it as negative. But it's actually what the planet needs. It's what we need. Probably. Now, I'm not God here any more than any of the rest of us in the room. Which means we're all God, in my opinion, but that's a whole other story. So I don't know, you know, my take is this is what we need to be doing, and that's what permaculture is about, is how do we descend from this peak of energy and resource use, pollution production, waste production, population, while regenerating the planet. Can we grow food that, in a way that rather than agriculture being the most destructive force on the planet, which is what it is, that was former rainforest, remember? Can we actually heal the planet while we take care of our own needs? And I believe we can. And that's what permaculture is all about. Sustainability is actually the wrong frame. Because if we're trying to sustain this, what will happen? It might be possible. But I think sustainability is something that only our great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be able to say, yes, we are sustainable because we are living in a way that's similar to the way our grandparents lived. And it's only going to be known in historical hindsight. So, thank you, Office of Sustainability. I'd like to suggest a name change. Office of Regeneration. But, you know, the key issue of our age is, as David Holmgren says, how do we make a graceful and ethical ascent from the peak of energy production? Because all the problems we face are tied up in that. Perhaps. And this is a cultural thing. This is a cultural challenge. And so if you imagine this whole board represents the world of nature, and this big circle here represents the world of culture, point number one is that culture is part of nature. I like to think of culture, permaculture, as ecological culture design. It's actually I prefer the phrase ecological culture design to permaculture, actually. Because what's permanent? Change. Right? So, if we're going to be designing an ecological culture, we've got to know what culture is. What are we doing? So here's a model. Here's one model for what culture could be. And it starts with resources. You've got a tree. I think I have a tree. No, I don't have a tree in this image. All right? You have a tree out here in nature, and it's got its own intrinsic characteristics, its own reasons for being, its own direction in life. And then a human being comes along and says, oh, I can get 2 logs of lumber out of that. And that tree moves from here across this boundary into here. It becomes a resource. It's a perceptual phenomenon. Trash is generally not considered a resource much, although there's people looking at it that way and now learning how to make money off of it in a different way than they were, doing recycling and so on. A lot of our waste paper in this country gets shipped to China to make cardboard so they can ship products back to us. Okay? That's a form of functional interconnection. So, resources, first thing. And the second piece here is technology. The tools that we are literally surrounded by. You know? Clothing is a tool, it's a technology. Clicker, laser pointer, computer, water bottle, seats, the building, it's all technology. We're a tool-making species. And there's a double-headed arrow here, because if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, as they say. And if you perceive a resource, you're going to develop tools to use that resource. So these two things are interrelated. And when permaculture first started, it really focused on these two pieces of the culture pie, mostly to the exclusion of other things. And then, of course, we learned. And we started looking at the next piece, the social and economic structures. Because you can't separate them. There's a double-headed arrow here and there, because how many people here know how to make a flint knife? Raise your hand. All right, we got 2 people who know how to make a flint knife. Did you learn that at the university? You didn't? Plymouth State, what's the deal? Right? Okay, you learned that in a mentored environment, correct? The Smithsonian. But you learned it from one person to another in a mentored situation, right? A mentoring culture, as opposed to a hierarchical institution, right? Different social structure, but if you want to build a nuclear plant, right? So you can use uranium, you can't learn that in a non-centralized, non-hierarchical, highly specialized institutional environment. So you can't separate these 3 pieces from each other. And most people in permaculture call this the invisible structures, which I think is a really not a good term, because look at look around the room, look at the way we're organized in the room. This is a social structure. It's actually quite obvious what the social structure is here, because I'm the top of the pile. I know everything, you know nothing. Right? That's what lecture implies. Kind of. I'm being extreme here, right? Of course it's not true. There's incredible knowledge and experience in this room. But you're here to listen to what I have to say. And I don't really care what you have to say. That's the other thing this structure says, kind of, right? So this is not invisible at all. It's just unconscious. And if we call it invisible, it's going to remain invisible. These are social and economic structures. And this is not enough. What I've found through my experience in life is that, and watching permaculture for 30 years, not 40, 30 years.
I'm just 30.
Is that the place where permaculture systems always seem to fail is in this department, right here. This stuff is relatively easy. Actually, the solutions are pretty clear at small scale. This is the stuff that's more challenging. And why does this fall apart? Well, it's because of this missing piece. That is actually the invisible structure, because it's what I call the cosmology. It's the inner landscape. It's our belief systems, our paradigm. How do we see the world? And if we do not consciously deal with this, we will not sustain a healthy ecosystem of all of this, the whole 9 yards at this point. We have to change our way of thinking. Right? It's a whole system. And we have to design it as a whole system. So, this is another one of my favorite quotes from Stuart Hill. The human species is psychosocially highly underdeveloped, and paradoxically, that's our greatest reason for hope. Because if we were genetically predisposed to be only at the level of psychosocial development we're at as a species right now, we'd be lost. There's no way we work our way out of this. But because we have so much room to grow, psychosocially, we actually might get our way out of this. Stuart Hill, his story is very interesting. I'll just say that. All right, this quote changed my life in 1999. We see things not as they are, we see things as we are. We see things not as they are, we see things as we are. Who do you want to be? What do you want to see? Who do you want to be? What do you want to see? Really useful questions. So, that brings me to the question, what problem lies at the core of all of this that I'm talking about? Because if we don't know what the core problem is, then we're not going to solve that problem. We're going to solve some other problem. And I have this game that I often play in my permaculture courses that I call the problem game. And in that game, we take 10 minutes and several sheets of paper on the wall, and we brainstorm. What are all the problems we're trying to solve with permaculture? Pollution, species extinction, loss of biodiversity, loss of habitat, toxic food, just on and on. We could brainstorm that ourselves here, right? I don't really want to do that right now. We just brainstorm all those different issues, and almost always something that relates to the idea of alienation or separation or disconnection comes up. And then we go through and look at that list and we say, okay, what are the problems that are more at the surface? What are the effects versus what are the causes? And we try to boil down, well, is pollution caused by, bad agriculture, or is, what, and we work our way down. It can take half an hour, 45 minutes, but my experience has been that just by facilitating that process and not biasing it at all, that we almost always come to the belief, the realization, that the belief in the separation between humans and nature is the cause of all the other problems. The belief that we are separate from each other, from God got us all that is, from nature, whatever. That belief is the core problem. And I've done that exercise with groups probably 10, 15 times, and it always gets the same answer. And the more I've looked at it for myself and worked with clients and worked with communities, the more I see that reality, and the more I look inside myself, the more I see that reality being true. So here's Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden with the flame, the sword of flame there from the angel. And they're ashamed of themselves because they ate fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they started seeing the world in a dualistic way. God and humans and nature, good, bad, right, wrong, etc. So if separation is the core problem, then that splitting humans from nature, that's a form of self-separation. And it takes many forms, that self-separation, and I've watched myself separate myself in many ways, and as the most extreme, self-separation is a form of self-hatred. Self-hatred is a form of self-separation. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of self-hatred out there in the world, and in here in the world. And I know it's in the room because I am in the room. Okay? I'm assuming it's also in the audience in various forms. And I just want to call your attention to that and say, hey, this is part of the issue. So, It's much more common, and it reasserts itself in a lot of different ways, and it colors a lot about how we talk about, think about, and act, and perceive in the world. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do now as I teach permaculture and edible forest garden and stuff is to really draw attention to this and be conscious about how ecology actually tells us the reality. Because the reality is that separation does not exist. We can believe in it. You're free. You're a free being. You're free to believe in separation, if you so choose. But it's kind of like running away from your own feet. It's kind of hard to do. Because the reality is that there's unity. There's no separation. We're interconnected. We're all part of the same deal. So here's the paradigm shift, okay? So Bill Mollison once famously said, one of the co-founders of permaculture once famously said that permaculture is about working with nature, not against her. And that sounds great, right? But the reality is that that phrasing is still coming from the paradigm that humans and nature are separate. We're working with nature, but she's over here. Hi, nature, we're working with you. It's not true. Unconscious framing, continuing the separation. Penny Livingston Stark from California, a permaculture designer from California, realized that, and she thought to herself, self? What would it sound like to say the same thing that Bill Mollison said from the paradigm that humans and nature are one system? We are nature working. I heard some, right? It landed someplace inside, right? That's a whole different paradigm. We are nature working. We are nature listening. We are nature speaking. We are nature dreaming, sleeping, making love, cooking, gardening. We are nature. Some people get vehemently angry at this idea. I've had some interesting emails from people. That's cool. That's fine. It's still true, even if you don't agree. So God got us all that is has become nature. Nature has become us. Then who the heck are we? Are we God's children? Are we adolescents, the way our culture seems to treat us? Or are we techno monkeys? Notice the similarity in the posture at the beginning and the end of the series there. I am guilty of that posture. All right, so if all that's true, who are we ecologically? All right, what is our appropriate ecological role? Well, the word keystone comes to mind. Anyone here know what a keystone species is? Raise your hand. All right, a few of you. A keystone species, salmon, the keystone species, top predators, alligators, keystone species. They are species whose behavior and population affects all the other members of their ecosystem. Salmon, they gain all kinds of nutrients, mineral nutrients, while they're in the ocean, growing larger and larger and larger, and then they swim upstream, and it is possible to say with great accuracy that the upper reaches of the Connecticut River watershed and most of the watersheds in North America are actually made of salmon. Because so many nutrients were brought upstream for so long and then eaten and spread all over the landscape by the ecosystem that it enriched the whole watersheds. And we're now suffering from that lack of salmon in this watershed that we're in right now. Well, we're not in the Connecticut. We're in the Pemigewasset, right? That's not the Connecticut. But still, I'm sure there is salmon coming up the Pemigewasset, right? Top predators. You know, there's a study that came out about when they reintroduced the wolves, of the change in the pattern of vegetation in the not yet, was it Yellowstone? Yellowstone. I was going to say Yosemite. And without the top predators, all of the moose and elk and all those big herbivores were hanging out down where the succulent vegetation was down in the river valleys, and it changed the pattern of vegetation. They overate the browse down there, and the browse up in the hills didn't get eaten much. And succession took place. And once the wolves came back, they were moving all over, and they were causing disturbance all over, and it completely changed the vegetation structure of the whole watershed of Yellowstone because of the top predator. Alligators like to stay wet. There's a dry season in Florida. So they make alligator holes so they can stay moist and cool, and it also brings their food to them because everybody else needs to drink water during the summertime too. And so the deer and other animals all come to drink from the alligator holes, and the alligators will pick a few off every day to keep themselves fed. But most of the animals, it's worth the risk because you're unlikely to be the one who gets eaten that day. Right? But the fact that there's alligator holes changes the successional dynamic, the pattern of water flow, the survivability of all the other mammals in the ecosystem. They change the dynamic of the whole ecosystem, and so do we. We are a keystone species. And guess what? We simply have to master our role. Because if we shrink from that role and say, oh, I'm going to make myself smaller, and I'm unimportant, and I'm not good, and I hate myself as a human being, and I'm just going to make myself small and go into this corner over here and just try to have as little impact as possible, we're still going to be a keystone species. And the fact is that we can be an incredibly powerful force for good on the planet. And if we don't embrace that, we're not going to make it. Besides the fact that we have a responsibility to regenerate and heal the planet, if you want to be moral about it. But on a very practical level, you don't have to be moral at all. On a very practical level, for our own survival and our children's survival, we have to master our role as a keystone. Respond to change. And that means that our needs are valid. Denial and self-hate isn't going to help anyone. We've got to love ourselves. We've got to love ourselves. So the only question then becomes, how do we best serve? How can we take that role? So here's one way. And I want to reiterate before I move into the whole ecosystem mimicry agriculture piece that permaculture is about culture design. Culture design. Culture design. I'm going to focus on the agriculture here for a while because for multiple reasons. And I'll get to those. But I just want to reiterate the culture design piece. And I'll keep circling back to it, but I just want to hit it again. So for me, the mission of ecosystem agriculture generally really comes from this one sentence from Masanobu Fukuoka's classic book, The One Straw Revolution. I think this is probably the most important sentence of the whole book. He says, the ultimate goal of farming is not the cultivation of crops, not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Because how we farm and garden reflects the way we see the world. If we see the world as a collection of independent, isolated elements that don't interact, then we're never going to understand how natural systems work, and so we're never going to be able to garden or farm in a way that mimics the way natural systems work. So the ultimate goal of ecosystem agriculture is not just to grow crops. Yes, food is important, but also the cultivation and perfection of new ways of seeing, thinking, being, and acting in the world. And so, agriculture, the way we do our agriculture, is the place where, that's where we do our best to embody the principles of nature, of natural systems, and learn from the direct feedback we get from our interaction with natural systems in our agriculture, so we can get better at applying those principles, so then we can try applying those principles in the more challenging, more abstract realms of social systems, economic systems, the inner landscape. Those are the parts that are really the hardest place to apply these principles. And by learning it with our agriculture, we feed ourselves, we begin to heal the planet, we learn how to heal the planet, and we get to demonstrate to ourselves that we understand how these principles work so we can apply that. Right? So the agriculture piece is multifunctional in that way because it keeps us going while we learn. So we can then apply the ideas to the rest of the culture. I just said the same thing 3 different times, in 3 different ways. So the critical integration here is that we're trying to integrate ecology, the study of the household, with agriculture, or field cultivation is the literal translation of that word, with design, which literally means to mark out. And ecosystem agriculture occupies this space where all 3 come together. So we're trying to design agricultural systems that mimic natural ecosystems, ideally the ecosystems that are native to the place where you are currently living. Right? And what does that mean? What's mimicry? Mimicry, ecologically, is when you have the close external or functional resemblance of one species or system or element to another. Usually in natural systems, mimicry occurs as a way, it evolves as a way to gain adaptive advantage. For example, the monarch butterfly, people probably know this story, but I'll repeat it anyway. The monarch butterfly caterpillar eats only milkweeds. Milkweeds contain a latex that has a chemical called cardiac glycosides. Cardiac glycosides can stop the vertebrate heart. If you eat too much of it, the caterpillar stores that chemical in its body, thereby becoming toxic to birds, which are its main predators. Once it becomes a butterfly, it still has the cardiac glycosides in it. It's still toxic to the birds. And so if you're flying around as a butterfly and you're toxic to your main predator, and your main predator is a visual predator that can see color, then it would be adaptive for you to have what the ecologists call warning coloration. Warning coloration is, I don't have black on, but I have the orange. If I had black on, I could be the orange and black. Well, you got a little bit of black here. Right? Black and orange wings, very strong image. A bird eats one monarch butterfly and has its heart going, oh, don't want to eat that again. Oh, I remember what that looked like. Yeah, I'm going to avoid that from now on. Right? So that's how it evolved with the monarch. But the viceroy butterfly it eats aspen trees. It's totally edible by birds. But it's to its advantage to look like a monarch butterfly to avoid getting eaten. That's mimicry. It's similar to what happened in Elizabethan England when Queen Elizabeth decided she wanted to be, Queen Elizabeth or Queen of Victoria? I think Queen Elizabeth decided she wanted to be the Virgin Queen, and she started putting white lead makeup on her face, right? So she'd look more virginal. And then all the courtiers started putting white lead paint on their faces too, and they all got brain damage together. But it was to their short-term advantage, at least, to put that lead paint on their face so they would look like the queen, because it was to their adaptive advantage. Somehow they still built an empire. All right, so we're trying to mimic ecosystems in our human habitat designs, and by doing that, we remember ourselves as part of nature, and that's one way we heal our self-separation. The mimicry is a way to remember ourselves as part of nature. So what are we trying to mimic in our agriculture? All right, this is not in my book, just so you know. If you have my books or you're thinking you're going to buy them, this is not my book, so you might want to write it down. We're mimicking 4 key fundamental things from ecosystems. We're mimicking the properties, the principles, the patterns, and the processes. The properties are our design aims. We're going to talk briefly about each one of these. Properties are our design aims, the ecosystem properties we want to have show up. The principles are strategies that ecosystems use to make those properties arise. And then we have the structure and function, or patterns and processes, that we actually are going to directly try to understand and use in our designs. So properties, principles, patterns, and processes. The properties are things like stability, resilience, self-maintenance, self-regulation, self-renewal, self-fertilization, production of clean air, clean water, increase in water storage capacity, biodiversity, and soil quality over time, and on and on and on. I can make a longer list than this, but this is a good enough start. Why is it a good enough start? Because, number one, I can tell you, at least theoretically, how to create all of these properties in a designed ecosystem. My book tells you how to do that. And it's also a good enough start because ecosystems, a lot of these properties come as a package deal. If we design a system that has all of these, a lot of the other ones are going to come along as part of it as well. Because that's how ecosystems operate. Now, the key thing here is that these are what we call emergent properties. They emerge only from the dynamics between the elements of the system. They're not necessarily the properties of any particular element in the system. It's just like my body, okay? Here I am standing here. I have an idea of what's on the screen. I'm standing upright. I haven't fallen over yet, at least. I've got a clicker in one hand, a laser pointer in the other. I'm making eye contact with different people in different parts of the room at different times. I'm trying to keep my voice at a certain level so everyone can hear me clearly. My brain can't do that alone. My heart can't do that alone. My stomach can't do that alone. My bones can't do that alone. My sinews, my digestive tract, my little toe cannot do any of those things alone. Only the whole system of all those elements interacting can have the emergent properties of standing upright, keeping track of what I'm saying as I look across the room, keep my voice to the right level, and be clear, at least most of the time, which object I have in which hand so I can use the right thing at the right time. Emergent properties. We are made of. We are embodiments of emergent properties, but our culture does not teach us to see the world this way. So we don't. And our culture does not teach us how to create emergent properties in a conscious way. And so we're not as good as we could be. And I would like to have a garden that had these qualities, wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be great? Self-maintaining. That's the holy grail right there. Self-maintenance. Anyone here know the Arthurian legends? You'll know that only one knight of the Round Table achieved the Holy Grail, and when he did, he died. So chances of having a completely self-maintaining garden are low, but we can certainly strive. All right, now if we take these different properties and we stack them up, if we imagine that nature and agriculture are two ends of a continuum, and we stack up these properties in the middle here and say, how do these two ends of the continuum stack up against these properties? We can say that nature is not very fragile, very resilient, has a high diversity, high functional interconnection between species, which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit. Whereas agriculture has high fragility, low resilience, can't bounce back after disturbance on its own. It needs human input to do that. Has low diversity, ideally, one species of corn, even one genetic variant of corn for 1,000 acres. That's low genetic diversity. And then low functional interconnection as a result. You have high rate of nutrient flow, all from fertilizers, almost all from fertilizers. You're getting sun and fossil fuels. 10 calories of energy for every calorie of energy that we grow in this country. 9 of those calories from fossil fuels. Over here we've got low rate of nutrient flow, local recycle mostly, or at least part of the natural biogeochemical cycle. And we've got solar energy only here. Amount of management is low. Amount of waste and pollution is low or none. But amount of food produced is low, especially after 500 years of mismanagement by our culture. Over here we have high management, high waste and pollution, but a high amount of food produced per acre. So what organic agriculture is trying to do is start here at agriculture, move this direction, maintain high food production, but reincorporate some of these beneficial qualities over here using composting and crop rotations and all kinds of other stuff, right? Cover cropping, as a way to improve some of these qualities, but maintain high food production. That's great. I totally support that. We're getting most of our food out of annual plants. That's going to remain so for a long time to come, if not forever. But what I'm talking about here is, let's start over here at nature, mimic natural ecosystems so that we get as many of these properties continuing as possible, but try and increase the amount of food that we're producing. Okay? And doing this is going to help us learn how to do this better. Okay? So, in terms of yield, there's a lot of debate going on in various places about this question. How much yield can you get from perennial agriculture? We don't have good data for temperate ecosystem mimics, but you look at net primary productivity of ecosystems across the globe. We've got extreme desert here. We've got tropical forests, swamps and marshes, attached algae and estuaries. This is thousands of calories per square meter per year. We've got 9 million calories per square meter per year here with the tropical forests, the swamps and marshes and estuaries. And up there we've got 14,000 calories per square meter per year. That would keep, if you could eat all this primary productivity here, if all of that was edible by a human, that would keep you alive for about a week. That's a year's production on a square meter. It would keep you alive for about a week in a desert. But here, I haven't done the math yet. How many days would that be? 2,000 calories a day divided by 9 million divided by 2,000 calories a day. What is that? 45, 450? No. 4,500 days or something. If you could eat all of it. But of course you can't eat all that biomass. It's sunlight being converted to biomass. You can only eat a portion of that. Even with the agricultural land, you get 2,925 calories, or 2,925,000 calories per square meter per year. Most of that is roots and stems and leaves and chaff, and then you have your grain. You got maybe 1% of this biomass is edible. But look, we've got temperate forest. What we've got around here, temperate forest, is twice the amount of production as that. If we can get half the percentage of yield out of this biomass, we'll have the same production per unit area as that. We've got some room to play. And if we go for diverse yields, not just food, but also craft materials and fertilizer and chicken food and whatever, we might be able to get higher. We might. We might. But of course, we don't really know. We're just at the infancy. We're just past zygotic stage of this practice in Western culture. But what we're talking about here is trying to take the design elements and create dynamics of an ecosystem that will give us the desired conditions. So we have site conditions, desired components of the ecosystem, patterning, and management. We're trying to integrate all of that to get succession that's directed the way we want it to, minimal competition, minimal herbivory, sustainable water demand, self-renewing fertility, healthy plants, and over-yielding polycultures. We want those to be the emergent properties of what we're trying to design so we can get our high diverse yields, our maximum self-maintenance, minimum cost, and maximum ecological health goals. This is not simple.
No.
Right? But, you can do it in a suburban space. This is at a winery in California, Copita Gardens, and it looks like a suburban landscape, but almost everything there is edible. All right, there's a list of species in my book. But we're trying to mix these goals, and in ecosystem ag, these top three goals especially are mutually reinforcing. Self-maintenance, high diverse yields, maximum ecological health, they can actually support each other. Whereas if you're going for maximum yield in an agricultural context, you're not going to have minimum maximum self-maintenance or maximum ecological health. You're going to be simplifying the system too far. All right, so that's about properties. Then we have principles. Now, principles are an interesting thing because they're inherent in natural systems, but we have to observe them to discern them. So we observe in nature that everything has more than one function. Everything interacts in multiple ways with its environment. And that observation leads us to the understanding of the principle of multiple functions, which is that every design element should have more than one function, preferably more than three. And by having this design directive, we start looking at every design element, whether it's a rock or a plant or a person or a cow or a rabbit or a chicken or whatever, and we say, what are all the different ways that it interacts with its environment? And that opens our eyes to all the ways that it does interact, so we can actually get more yield out of it and actually minimize stress on the element. And then we realize that systems are erratic and they fail sometimes, and that you have many organisms filling every community niche, every community function, every purpose in a community. You've got more than one producer, more than one consumer. You have redundancy there. So the principle of redundancy arises. You want to fulfill every critical need in more than one way. And that's one of the foundations of resilience. If you have only one water supply and that gets contaminated, you're stuck. All right? And then we have that realization that ecosystems consist of webs of interdependence and cooperation. And those webs generate stability and resilience and harmony. There's no pollution or waste in ecosystems, very little or no. And one person's waste is another person's food. That observation gives rise to the principle of functional interconnection, that you want to place design elements so that the needs of one element are met by the inherent products of another. I have a scratch on my back, you got fingernails. Right? The chicken body heat is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Greenhouses need to get heated in the wintertime. Put your chickens in the greenhouse, you get in the body heat. You get in the carbon dioxide. The plants are getting the carbon dioxide. Chickens also give off a lot of dust. The plants don't like dust. That's a problem, but you got to solve that. You can get those other benefits if you can deal with that problem. All right? So there's many other principles we can talk about, but these are some of the key ones, and these are all strategies that we can use in design in many different places in our design projects. Building design, garden design, social structure design, these principles apply in any realm. And they're going to help create healthy ecosystem function and help us get those desired properties, those ecosystem properties that we want. So then we look at pattern and process or structure and function, and we can get very practical here. There's 4 really fundamental, really important aspects of structure and function here. We've got the physical architecture of the ecosystem, we've got the social structure of the ecosystem, we've got the self-renewing fertility and succession. And volume 1 of my book goes into each one of these in some detail. But we have to understand what ecosystem we're looking at so we can mimic it. And we're talking about modeling our agriculture on forest ecosystems. So here is a forest garden at Robert Hart's place near Wales, in Shropshire, England. And it looks very foresty. But it's actually only 40 by 80 feet in size, and it has fields on 3 sides. But look how foresty it is. And almost everything you see in that image is edible. A forest garden is a forest mimic. We're using the forest as a design metaphor. You don't have to have woods to have a forest garden. In fact, I prefer that people start with lawn. I forget the statistic exactly what year it was that I got the statistic. I think it was 1990. As of 1990, I believe it was, 12% of the continental United States was lawn. And I'm sure that's gone up since then, right? 12% of the continental United States lawn, and a lot of the water, the toxic runoff going into water, is coming from lawns. So I'd prefer that people take their lawn and convert it to forest garden. We've done a lot of damage to our existing woods. I encourage you to stay away from going into the existing woods and forest gardening there. You might do a little bit of careful planting of natives and so on, but I encourage you to start with what's already damaged and go from there. So we're constantly designing an ecosystem. We're creating perennial polycultures of multi-purpose plants. And this is the key piece here. A perennial has a 3 to 3,000 year lifespan. A polyculture has many species in one patch of ground. That is what a polyculture is, and that's all a polyculture is. We'll get into that a little bit later. Each species has ideally at least 3 uses or functions, including food, fuel, fiber, fodder, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, and fun. Try it. Come on, try it. All right, so this is a forest garden at 7,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains at Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute. It's on the dry side of the Rockies. They don't get a lot of rain up there. If they can do it there, I'm sure you can do it here. All right? You've got borage. There's some perennial onions here. I forget what species that is. I believe that's bird's foot trefoil. There's apples, and there's Carragona arborescens, which is a Siberian pea shrub, which is a great chicken food, nitrogen fixer. So some pretty cool plants there. Much more limited palette than you have here at 7,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains. It's many fewer species. I talk about uses and functions. A use is a direct human use. A function is generally an ecosystem support function. We have fruits, nuts, greens and shoots, roots, culinary and tea plants, and mushrooms. This fruit here is hardy kiwi. Hardy kiwi, Actinidia arguta, or Actinidia colomicta. Hardy to zone 3. Plant hardy to zone 3. More vitamin C than lemons. Apparently so much vitamin C, I haven't tried this myself yet, but apparently if you take the unripe fruit and put it in a box or bucket, it will store for 4 to 6 months in your basement with no refrigeration. That's how much vitamin C it has. It's considered very medicinal by the Chinese. The leaves and the flowers and the fruit are all medicinal. It's adapted to the forest edges of northeastern China, which is a similar climate to what we have here. It is now considered, it is about to become illegal to grow in Massachusetts because they consider it invasive. I ask you though, all right, this is the Norse answer to citrus. Is it worse to have a potentially an edible species potentially spreading all over the landscape on its own, or is it worse to be trucking citrus from Chile and California and Florida at high energy cost and changing the climate in the process? What's worse?
Depends who's in charge.
Point taken. This nut here is a butternut. This is a native nut. It grows in these parts. DAcres has some butternut, at least one butternut that I saw growing at their place. This species is very high in omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Very good for the body. Having some problems with pests and diseases in the Northeast now, in its native habitat now. Some of those pests and diseases are native, some are imported. It turns out, though, the Native Americans were burning their butternut groves every 3rd April on rotation, according to one anecdotal report that I read. And the author of that report thought that they were doing that because when you burn the ground in April before the leaves come out, you blacken the ground. It warms the ground, which warms the air temperature. That means that when the pollen lands on the flowers of the female flowers, that the pollen will grow faster to fertilize the seed and you get more nuts. All right? By burning the ground, you get more nuts. But it's possible that if you wanted to do that for more nuts, you might do that more than every 3rd year. So my contention is that they're probably also doing it for pest control. And it turns out, if you read a book called 1491 by Charles Mann, most of the things we learned about what was going on in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus was completely wrong. The population estimates of the native peoples in these two continents has been increased by a factor of 10 or 12. Some parts of the eastern seaboard were more densely populated than parts of Western Europe at the time of European expansion to this continent. 90 to 95% of the Native Americans died in the first 20 years after contact because of communicable diseases they had no genetic experience with. And when the Pilgrims got here to Plymouth, not Plymouth, New Hampshire, they arrived at a landscape that had been released from management for a decade. So the vast majority of North and South America were managed landscapes for up to 40,000 years before Columbus got here, using fire. Most of the native species on this continent are fire adapted or fire facilitated. And that is one of the causes, in my opinion, of the inability of native plants to do well now is because we're not burning the landscape anymore. Smokey the Bear was wrong. So, anyway, this plant here is called Good King Henry. It's a perennial relative of lamb's quarters. Like lamb's quarters, the leaves are edible and the seed is edible. This one will tolerate partial shade. It is tap-rooted. Once it's established, it's there. It's a good pot herb, not as good a fresh green, at least to my taste buds. I like it better cooked, but it's a great plant. This one here, these two are both from Britain. Both have fallen out of favor there in general. This one here is called Skerrit, that has edible tubers, as you can see. They are mostly pinky size or smaller, big masses of pinky size or smaller tubers, hard to clean, hard to harvest. This species has had no breeding done on it. Because it's in the Apiaceae, it produces a lot of flowers in the umbel family, like Queen Anne's lace. All right, it produces a lot of seed, a lot of flowers. Probably in a few generations, we could generate cultivars that have fewer, larger tubers. They would be easier to harvest, easier to clean, more worth eating. These things taste great. I've eaten them. We don't know all the factors that make them grow well. I've gotten bumper crops in some places, and sometimes I get very few. I don't really know what the deal is. So we need to play with that one. This purple flower in the middle here is called Anis hyssop. It's native to western North America. It's a short-lived perennial, 3, maybe 4 years in one place, but it self-sows and spreads around. Great tea plant, culinary plant, great sun tea, and also what I call a bar and grill for beneficial insects because they go there and spend many happy hours. Then, of course, we have our gourmet decomposers, the mushrooms, and this being shiitake mushrooms. Very easy to grow, very high value crop. You can get $14 a pound for this in some markets. At least you used to be able to, and it's really not that hard to grow. Also highly medicinal. So those are some of the food uses. We have ecosystem functions as well. There's 2 main ecosystem functions. We have soil improving plants and plants that help deal with problem species. Nitrogen fixing plants, dynamic accumulators. Nitrogen fixers make a deal with bacteria. The bacteria live in the roots of the plant. The plant gives sugars to the bacteria. The bacteria then use some of that sugar to split nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere to make fertilizer for the plant. Wild blue indigo is a native one. We've got lupins all over the place up here, I expect. They're great. Many of these nitrogen fixers are actually toxic, though. You do not want to eat them. If you were high in protein, you'd be toxic too because you wouldn't want to be eaten by herbivores. If you were high in protein, they'd go after you more. Dynamic accumulators are plants that tend to have a deep taproot, and they will selectively accumulate certain minerals to high concentrations in their tissues. Comfrey is the best studied one of these, and we don't have a lot of good data on this behavior of plants, although I keep running across studies here and there. What was it I saw the other day? Nyssa tupelo. I don't think you can grow that up here. Sweet gum accumulates cobalt. I just saw a study. I was doing research for a book I'm working on now. It's known as a cobalt accumulator in the study in the Ecology magazine. Anyway, this one, Comfrey, accumulates 6 different mineral nutrients to high levels in its tissues. Really good soil improver. It'll also soak up, if there's nitrogen available, it'll soak up a lot of nitrogen. So 7 if you include nitrogen. Problem is, Comfrey is that it's hard to kill. If you put it in the wrong place, you can't get rid of it very easily. You do not want to till it. I've tried sheet mulching with cardboard and mulch, and it grows right through. I someday will try sheet mulching with plywood and concrete blocks. All right, then we have over here ground covers, which obviously are plants that cover the ground. The reason you grow those is to control succession, prevent the weeds from coming in and taking the system a different direction than where you want it to go. If you're going to grow ground covers, ideally you're going to have a polyculture of ground covers where you have clumpers, runners, and mat formers, all mixed together. They're going to do a better job of filling the space and keeping out the weeds than just having runners or just having clumpers. So here we have some ferns. We have a clumping fern, a running fern, and this mat former is called Labrador violet. Labrador violet is edible, kinda. All violets are edible. There's 450 species of violets that are edible on the planet. All of them are supposedly edible. Some taste better than others. The purple and white flowered ones taste better than the yellow flowered ones, generally, as a general rule. The flowers, the leaves, the stems, even the roots, but it's not worth cleaning the roots for what you get. No one has gone and studied and done a taste test. There's the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in Britain. They have over 1,050 named cultivars of violets in their database. As far as I know, no one has gone and tested those cultivars for their edibility. We have 1,050 named cultivars. You know, they're have consistent quality if they are edible, and no one's tested them except for me. I've started testing them. I've found 3 cultivars that are outstanding. Right? Here they are. They're called Viola Rebecca, Viola Little David, and Viola Delicia. And they taste like a mix of wintergreen and vanilla. And early in the season when it's cold, there's more wintergreen flavor, and as it gets warmer, the wintergreen goes away and the vanilla dominates. And they flower. These are cultivars. There's 70 named cultivars invented by this one guy in the 1800s in Britain. These 3 are some of the same. They're the only 3 I've been able to find in this country of these 70 cultivars that he created that are all from the same stock. So we may have 70 cultivars that may have a similar flavor, that will tolerate partial shade, and that taste like candy. Right? Anyone here got 3-year-olds who don't like vegetables? You know, try this. Viola Rebecca, Viola Delicia, Delicia, and Viola Little David. There's only one nursery where I know where you can get all 3. At least last year you could get all 3. It's called Squim Rare Plants. I'll spell that for you because it's in Squim, Washington, Sequim. Squim Rare Plants. Rebecca is available in a couple other places besides Squim Rare Plants, but you can mail order from them out in the panhandle of the peninsula of Washington. All right, so violets, you know, they spread like crazy. There's another one that I have that's a really nice ground cover that's called Cornish White. It's a very low ground cover, really nice ground cover, and you can let other things grow through that, no problem, but it does help keep the weeds down. All right, so anyway, then we have plants that are food and habitat for beneficial insects or other organisms. We have here Echinacea, which attracts a lot of beneficials, and yarrow, another dynamic accumulator. Yarrow is, Echinacea, of course, being medicinal, yarrow being medicinal as well. Anything in the aster, umbel, and mint families tends to be good for beneficial insects. Most of the beneficial insects have short, biting mouth parts with a short tongue. Like that, right? Whereas a butterfly has a long proboscis with a tongue that comes out the other side, the other end of it, the long end of it. A butterfly can stick its proboscis down a deep-throated flower to get nectar, whereas the biting mouth part predator and parasitoid insects need a short-throated flower to get nectar, because the nectar is what they use to energize themselves while they search for their prey or their host, so they can lay eggs in it or sting it, carry it back, and feed their young. All right, so you need these short-throated flowers, and you also would like to have a plant where one plant will provide nectar over a long period of time. And the aster, umbel, and mint family plants all have multiple flowers on each floret that all mature at a different time, so they're providing nectar for a long period. All right, so those are the best bets for attracting beneficials. Then we have this additional use and function here, which involves the ability of woody plants to resprout when cut. This is a willow that was planted, and then it was cut down, and it resprouted, and then a beaver ate it, and it's going to resprout again. That behavior is called coppicing. If you cut it up high, out of the reach of things like sheep, all right, it's called pollarding. Or as a Brit once said from back of the row one time, it's not pollarding, it's pollarding. I'm going to call it pollarding. All right, this is a pen and ink drawing by Van Gogh from 1884. Pollard birches. Very common practice throughout Europe. All right, coppicing and pollarding was the foundation of the medieval European economy. We are now in a hydrocarbon economy, and as oil gets more and more expensive, we're going to have to go back to a carbohydrate economy, and this behavior of woody plants will become essential to our health and survival and thrival in the future, in my opinion. So Mark Kravchuk and I, a guy from Burlington, Vermont, he and I are working now on a book on coppice agroforestry, which I don't know when it's going to be out, don't ask. Soon, but not soon enough. But here's sort of things you can do with coppice. Fertility plants. Willow accumulates magnesium. This is at Robert Hart's. He had a 40 by 20 foot block of willow that he was cutting at about this high, and it would let it resprout, and he'd cut it in the fall and use it as mulch, and he didn't know it, but he was adding magnesium to his forest garden. He's mulching with that, it's adding organic matter, it's helping keep the weeds down, and he's adding magnesium. You can do hugelkultur, which is not what this is, but you can use sticks and brush and stuff and pile that up and put soil on top and compost on top of it to deal with wet soils or to catch water and get some good yields out of that. It's useful for animal fodder, mushroom substrates, garden furniture, trellises, screens, arbors, garden stakes, leaf sticks, fence posts and horizontal, gates, ladder rungs, tool handles, rake and mallet heads, barrel hoops, pegs, ear teeth, and rope, gun stocks, wedges, erosion control materials. All right, that is hazel wattle fencing. Hazel, European hazel. I don't know if it's true of the American hazel yet. I haven't had a chance to find out. But European hazel is the only species that we know of that you can bend 180 degrees, and if you're twisting it as you bend it 180 degrees, it will not break. So you can weave all kinds of stuff with it when it's green, and then it dries and it's like a rock. All right. So hazel wattle, WATTLE.com. That's where I got these images. It's a British company that sells material. All right. You can also get furniture, baskets, boxes, crates, woodware, mats, trimming, novelty, toys, trimmings, crafts, shoe lace, clog soles, tennis rackets, snowshoes, golf clubs. We have a bark basket, a cherry trivet, a willow basket, a cherry table, a maple chair, and Mark Kravchuk, my co-author on the coppice book, he does fine woodworking. You can use coppice material to make very expensive dining room furniture. Okay, it doesn't have to look funky like this, although some people like the funky. And things like building materials, poles, posts, beams, wattle, shingles, thatch, beer poles, sauna benches, playground sections, firewood, pulp, charcoal, biomass energy, aromatic charcoal, and this is only a small portion of the list of what you can use coppice for. Okay, axles, all kinds of stuff. It's crazy. All right, so forest gardening has been done for thousands of years in the tropics. Thousands of years. Tens of thousands of years, probably. And there's been a lot of research done on it in the tropics, not much in temperate climates. It's been practiced on all the tropical continents. In Java, home-scale forest gardens were 15 to 50% of village croplands since at least 1000 AD. We've got written documentation of that. This is in Guatemala. Over 200 species in a very small area. Easily, everything is usable there. This is in the Middle East, in a river valley where they've got some water. They've got dates, figs, bananas, and olives in a multi-stored agriculture. Right? So this is well documented, well commonly used in the tropics, not very common in the temperate areas. Robert Hart's forest garden. Here's his house. Here's his forest garden. He's got a field on that side, a field on this side, a field on this side. Still very woodsy. Now, Robert was a trip. He's a very interesting character. He died in 2003, I think it was. When Eric, my co-author on this book, and I were over there for 4 days at his place, making the only accurate map of his forest garden that we know of that exists, he kept saying to us, "I don't really know much about plants." And you can tell. I mean, all of these are fruit trees, and they're so close together. They're all like, "Ah, get out of the way! I want some sun! Hey, come on, come on!" I don't really know much about plants. And look, that's so thick you can barely walk around in there. The guy made almost every mistake you can make in designing a forest garden, and it still worked. The last 3 years of his life, he could barely walk. He did very little maintenance. He still ate out of that garden almost every day of the growing season. You couldn't say that about a vegetable garden very easily unless you were eating grass. Right? Quack grass, it's medicinal, but you don't want to eat too much. Problem. I haven't tried. Maybe you do. I don't know. Go ahead. Let me know how it works. All right. If you look at Robert Hart, the map. Okay. This is the canopy of his garden. You've got one path there. You've got one path there. This is 40 feet across. There's no interior paths. You've got a very dense canopy there, a dense canopy there. You'd think this opening here and this opening here would be where the shrubs are organized, but no. The densest shrubs are right underneath that. I don't really know much about plants. Plus, they're clay soils. It rains all the time there in that part of Britain. It rained every day we were there. And so you've got clay soils, and you're walking around, trucking through the garden, and you're going to compress the soils. Plant roots don't like compressed soils, compacted soils. And if you've got a lot of ribes, a lot of gooseberries and currants in this garden, and if he had a fungal disease on the leaf of one thing, and he's walking through the brush and making his way through the brush, and there's a fungal disease gets on his pants, and he keeps trucking through the garden, and you brush against some other gooseberries, you're going to spread that disease around. You don't want that. It's not a good design. But I'll tell you, this garden was so beautiful. So beautiful that when I first walked into this thing, something hit me like bam, bam, right here and here. And I just started crying. And it's a mystery. I don't know. That was an immersion property that I don't know how he made it happen. But, I would redesign his garden for practical reasons so it had cross paths and you had keyhole beds here, this keyhole pattern, so you can reach to this shrub here from all sides, still harvest it, maintain it, but not step on the soil very often. So the plants know, this is compacted soil, this is uncompacted soil, I'm safe here, I'm over here at my own risk. But I don't know if this would have the same kind of beauty that his garden had without that. This is in North Carolina. These folks, Deb and Charlie, love plants so much they're allowing their house to get swallowed. They have a meadow between the street and the sidewalk here. This is their driveway. This is their same driveway here. So this is the south side of the house here. This is about a 4-foot space right there. And they've got pear trees. They've got grapes growing on this trellis. They've got all kinds of food in here. And this whole side of the house, this is North Carolina, okay? It gets hot. It gets hot. And this whole side of the house, this is the kitchen window. There's a bathroom above that. There's a living room here. They could barely live in that side of the house all summer. They got these columnar pears. These are pears, cultivars that are bred to remain narrow. You don't have to prune them. They stay like this. They don't go, ooh, and you cut them back. You just, right? Warren and Magnus, M-A-G-N-E-S-S, those are the cultivars. He says for 20 years he's had these there, and he's never had a pest or disease problem on these pears. In North Carolina, okay, columnar, 4-foot diameter, shade that window and that wall, they can inhabit the living room now. This trellis has muscadine grapes, a very hot tolerant grape, goes all the way to the top of the second-story window of the bathroom. Once those muscadines leaf out in the springtime, bam, instant shade, they can live in the kitchen and the bathroom during the summertime now. And they're getting food, and this is very hot. You got the sun beating on the wall, reflecting off the wall, beating on the driveway, reflecting off the driveway. It's a very hot microclimate, and the plants are out there going, water, it's hot, come on, give me some water. And so you can just go out there, and because you have this downspout and these barrels and this little soaker hose here, you can just go, eat, 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 eat. And the soaker hose will go, and the plants go, ah. That's close to self-maintenance. By design. In the backyard, it's a 50 by 90 foot space, and they're a mile from the city center of Greensboro, North Carolina, and you can barely tell. You can barely see the neighbor in the back because it's so full of vegetation. It's hard to take a good picture of it. It's so cramped with stuff. But this is a hardy kiwi trellis. They've got all kinds of fruit trees. They've got a pond here. You can kind of barely see. It's kind of dark, but that takes runoff from the roof of the garage. Provides habitat for frogs and salamanders. And those frogs and salamanders go out at night and they eat pests in the garden. They do have some annuals. This is zucchini here. They got some asparagus, some tomatoes are growing there. The year I was there. This is a wall, a terrace wall. They used logs to build. Okay, very cheap from a tree that came down. And if you look at this from plan view, you'll see they've got. Here's the log wall. Here's the pond. Here's the fig tree. Redbud has edible pods, edible fruits. Edible flowers. All kinds of fruit trees back here. A mulberry bush. They put an estimated 68 hours per year into this 50 by 90 foot space to maintain that space. 68 hours for the whole year. 10 hours a week for 2 weeks in the spring, and 10 hours a week for 2 weeks in the fall, and about an hour a week for every week in between, mostly managing the annuals. And they got 8 months of worth of food out of it. They've got a space here with a grape arbor over it with a table and multiple chairs. They can have friends over for dinner, and they get to have a comfortable space to live outdoors with their friends amidst the garden. They've got a single cafe table there. 1 or 2 people can sit out there, drink tea, read a book. They've got mulberries and peaches and plums and figs and roses and prunes all around them. And it's an Eden, right? It's a habitable outdoor living room. Make your garden a living room, because the more you live in the garden, the more the garden will live in you. The more you live in the garden, the more the garden will live in you. So, they're getting fruits, flowers, mint for their juleps, strawberries for their daiquiris, All right, there's a lot of different kinds of forest gardens. We can do old field mosaics. This old field mosaic is a stage of succession. Just so to make sure everyone knows, succession is this process. If you've taken a field and you plow it up, so it's bare soil, and you say, I don't want to do this anymore. And so you just sit on your back porch looking out at the field for the next 50 years and watch that field go through change over time. It's going to have annual weeds come up the first year. They'll cover it, and then the perennial weeds, the grass will start coming in, and the shrubs and the trees will start coming in, and then the trees will take over eventually, and it'll become a forest, but mostly it's going to be sun-loving trees at the beginning, and then the shade-loving trees will come in underneath the sun-loving trees and shade out the sun-loving trees, and that process of ecosystem change over time is called succession. And as we follow that successional process through time, that mid-stage where you've got a mixture, a mosaic of field with shrub clumps and tree clumps, that's the old field mosaic. And we can mimic that in the design of our gardens. And in fact, mid-succession like this is the most productive. That table I had with the red bar graph where it had temperate forest, that was mature temperate forest. Mid-succession temperate forest is actually more productive even than mature temperate forest by about 10 or 20%. And the good thing about that is that most of the species that we have that are perennials, that are already developed crops that have been bred for a number of years, they're all mid-succession species. They're short-statured plants, multiple stems, apples and peaches and pears and stuff. They're not big forest trees like a chestnut and 70 or 100-foot tall tree. They're short trees. They're mid-succession, and that's the most productive habitat ecologically, and we have the plants that are there to grow it. So actually, forest garden is kind of the wrong idea, maybe. It's a metaphor, because we're using all stages of succession. I'm going to skip that one, sorry. Forest gardens in the woods. Now, you can do this if you have woods and you want a forest garden in the woods. You can do this. There's not as many developed crops for the shade. There just aren't. And it's hard to get fruit to grow in the shade, because fruit is the last thing on a plant's energy budget wish list. Well, you can grow good greens. You can grow some root crops if you give them time. Some fruits. There's a couple fruits. Pawpaws will make some fruit in the shade. They'll make more in the full sun. But the best fruit for shade is currants and gooseberries. I've seen wild American red currants producing prolifically in deep shade under sugar maples. Right? And Martin Crawford in Britain did a study with red currant, European red currant, under shade cloth. He found 40%, up to 40% shade cloth, no drop in yield of fruit. 40% shade. So that gives you an indication. All right? But there's a lot of interesting medicinals you can grow in the woods. Some of these other things, miner's lettuce, violets, nodding onions, ramps, which are an excellent, I highly recommend ramps. Allium tricoccum is a perennial onion, native. One of the best wild edibles in the Northeast, in my opinion, if you like onion flavor, anyway. But really sweet, oniony flavor. They have 2 donkey ear-shaped leaves that come out for about a month, and then they die back and they're dormant for the rest of the year. Really good, really easy to propagate. Anyway, a bunch of species there. And then, of course, we have the coppice with standards. Coppice, the regrowth of the woody sprouts under a standard tree for nuts or timber production. And this is actually not an accurate drawing. I would like these to be shorter because you don't want in the coppice with standards, you don't want the coppice to get tall enough to interfere with the canopy of the overstory tree. So it's got to be a short to medium-term rotation on the coppice. But you can have nut trees or timber trees. You can have coppice for all kinds of other materials, for all those things I talked about earlier. And then you can have perennial vegetables and even livestock in the understory under that. And that is one of the kind of systems that was being used in Europe during the Middle Ages for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we don't have a huge amount of data on how they did that exactly. But Mark and I are trying to find out. So here's a coppice with standards in the winter after the coppice was harvested. Here it is when the regrowth is happening the next year. Notice this branch here that's all squiggling up and down. It's kind of going like that. The coppice grows up. The branch is going to avoid shading from the competition from those. You cut the coppice, the branch will grow down to avoid self-shading, and the coppice grows up, and then so it's going to go like this. This is not just the fiction from you see in those trippy drawings from Edwardian children's scary children's books. It's actually the way it was, or is. All right, then we have copses. The word copse comes from the word coppice, and that's a stand where you have only coppice material growing, and you're clear cutting it every whatever. Could be every year, every 50 years, every 20 years, depending on what the species is and what you're trying to get out of it. And so here's this foreground that was cut the previous winter. This is a year after cutting, and here's a person. And you can see this European chestnut, Castanea sativa, is already well over their heads in 1 year of growth. It's like 8 or 10 feet tall after 1 year of growth. That's the kind of production you can get off of these things. And then you can do larger scale. You get into alley cropping, where you can have, this. In this case, it's in Britain, a very windy part of Britain. That part of Britain that's very narrow, that starts shooting out towards Spain. So you have wind coming from the ocean from both sides. So they had to create a microclimate to be able to grow vegetables. And they planted rows of apples to create a windbreak and a warmer microclimate for the vegetables. This guy here in Washington State has tree hazelnuts, Turkish tree hazel, which grows about 50 feet tall. He has a hardy kiwi trellis running down the middle. And he has all this grass under here that if he had more people, he could have a more diverse ecosystem underneath here, but he's only one guy managing 15 acres of this. And so if you don't have a complex social structure, it's hard to have a complex ecological structure. So there's a correspondence in the social systems and the ecosystems. You want to have a complex, large-scale ecosystem to manage, you've got to have a complex human social structure. And then we have silvopasture, where you can have trees around or in the middle of the pasture. And actually I found a study just the other night when I was doing some research from the coppice book that indicates that if you have trees spread out in your pasture at the right density, you can actually increase the productivity of your pasture above what full sun pasture will give, because the plants actually shut down when it gets too hot. The grasses do. Most of the cool season grasses. So if you give them the right amount of shade, you get higher production of the grass and you get the stuff coming off the top, which could be timber, could be nuts, could be both. Could also be animal forage, because you can cut a lot of those things and feed it to the animals. And you can also, of course, do this on a rooftop. This is in Britain, in Reading, risc.org.uk. It's a huge forest garden. It's got trees, shrubs, and herbs all on the rooftop. They give you photographs, they give you construction details of how they did this. And the great thing about gardening on a rooftop is there's no deer. They might climb the staircase. I don't know. If they were really desperate. But can you imagine living in one of these apartments next door and looking at this rather than a rooftop? Can you imagine the savings in heating cost and cooling cost for the building underneath? Can you imagine the slowing of the rainfall hitting the roof and running off with this as opposed to a bare roof, and how that affects the temperature of water going into rivers and the quality of water and the amount of water running off into the rivers? Okay? We could completely change a lot of the watershed dynamics of urban areas by having rooftop gardens like this, while we're providing food and a pleasant place to hang out in the urban area. All right. Please stand up and be a tree. Stretch. We're coming into the home stretch. You okay? You guys okay to go longer? Yeah. All right. Take a seat, please. Yeah. You can open a door up top and hold it open. That'd be great. I'm sure it's hotter back there than it is down here. Okay. So this is where we get to the good part, folks. So we looked at this image earlier, and I don't have time to go into all these different aspects. Each one of these is like a half a day, really, to really give you a decent look at it. But I do want to give you some key points about the social structure part. And our models that we're trying to mimic here, up in the upper right here, this is a piece of about a square foot of old-growth forest in Massachusetts. And there's 9 species of plants in that square foot, as I recall. I counted it once. I haven't figured it out. I won't try and tell you what they are. We're getting low on time. But we're trying to mimic this level of diversity in our forest gardens with plants that may have never grown together before. We're going to be mixing wild edibles, native stuff from Eurasia, maybe stuff from South America, because we're looking for the best quality food in the smallest amount of space, right? Temperate deciduous forests have a tree canopy richness of 10 to 18 tree species per tenth of a hectare. A tenth of a hectare is about 100 by 100 feet. That's a quarter of an acre. Okay? That's a lot of trees in a quarter of an acre for a tree canopy. They don't have a very big canopy, because any one of those trees could easily cover half of that space, right? Full size. 10 shrub species per tenth of a hectare. 14 species per square yard in the herbaceous layer. 14 species per square yard, 35 to 40 species per habitat in the herbaceous layer. How many people here know a piece of woods that has that level of herbaceous diversity? Raise your hand. Nobody? Where? Where? Not very few pieces of woods actually have that many herbaceous species in a square yard. Pardon? I'm talking temperate deciduous forest.
Daniel Boone National Forest, Cumberland Plateau has some virgin native forest.
Yes. What that means, the fact that only one person raised his hand, because you know an actual specific piece of woods where you've got that level of herbaceous richness in the understory, it means that none of you know what a healthy temperate deciduous forest looks like except for him and me. All you've ever seen is a damaged ecosystem, folks. All you've ever seen is a damaged forest. That's painful, but it's real. You do not know what healthy ecosystems look like. All right? So we're trying to get that level of herbaceous diversity and maybe something like that level of woody diversity in our forest gardens with plants that may have never grown together before. How the heck are we going to do that? We want to have no competitive exclusion, okay? Competitive exclusion means that 2 plants have a similar niche and one's going to compete the other one until it's extinct. We don't want it, because if we have competitive exclusion going on and we want both species, that means we have to work to keep the species from getting excluded. We have to cut one back and nudge the other one along. That's work. I don't want to work in my garden. I want to eat in my garden. I want to play in my garden. Right? So how are we going to do that? This quote from David Perry is the key to that. Ecological communities are not as tightly linked as organisms, but neither are they simply collections of individuals. Rather, the community is a unique form of biological system in which the individuality of the parts acts paradoxically to bind the system together. You know exactly what that means, right? Hopefully by the end of the talk you will. And if you think you understand it, you'll understand it deeper. All right? Let me just say that this first sentence relates to about 100 years of argument in the science of ecology. Because there's kind of like, and don't take me wrong here, but there's kind of the libertarian wing of ecology science that says, oh, species are individuals, they have no interconnection, and they all act as individuals, and they don't actually form a community, they just have an overlapping of ranges. That's why we have the plant communities that we have. And then you've got the kind of more new agey side that says, oh, no, it's all a whole, and it's really beautiful, and it's like an organism, and this plant is like the heart, and this plant is like the lungs, and if you don't have all of them, it won't be healthy. And what he's saying is neither is true. That it's an odd mix of both. And I'm ranking on the new ages because I kind of like that. I was, anyway, until I actually learned ecology. So we start by understanding the niche of an individual species. What are its intrinsic characteristics? What are its functions? What are all of its relationships with its context? And you can look at that. It's an example of the principle of multiple functions, because we can say, okay, what are the contexts? Its native regions, native habitat, its native associates. What family is it in? What are its predators and allies? What are its needs and tolerances? This European pear needs full sun, 6 to 6.5 pH soil, plant hardy zones 4 to 9, moist, well-drained soil, prefers moderately deep to deep soils, tolerates clay. Not all trees tolerate clay. Prefers soils with low to moderate nitrogen content, high calcium demand, yields best when pruned, etc., 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 etc. We've got characteristics: upright tree, standard. It's got flat roots with sinkers, which is a different kind of root structure than other trees have. Different sizes for different rootstocks. Lifespan is 50 to 75 years. For the full-size tree, a dwarf, maybe 15 years. Produces fruit, yes, but it also produces white flowers in the spring, glossy green foliage, moderately dense shade, and we could go on. All these different things. And most of us, if you're a gardener at all, you're already doing this unconsciously with your plants, because most people who are gardeners know the answer to this question. Would tomatoes prefer a cool, shady location? Yeah, right. Why go on, right? But how about lettuce? Right? You do niche analysis. I call this niche analysis. We all do niche analysis all the time, of each other, of ourselves, of plants, of animals. We try to characterize who they are, what their needs are. But we can be much more clear and robust about it if we start writing it down and think through what are the categories that we need to know about and research those or observe them so we can design better. Because when we understand this, then we can design a system where the needs of this tree are getting met so it has less stress, and all of its yields, not just the fruit, are actually being utilized. So what plants like moderately dense to dense shade? Well, ramps would. We could grow ramps under the European pear and get 2 yields in the same space for the same amount of water and the same fertilizer. Right? High calcium demand. Well, do we know any plants that take calcium out of the subsoil and put it into the topsoil? Let's plant those near this and meet the needs of the plant without us having to actually buy fertilizer, which, guess what, is ground up rock from who knows where, shipped with energy from who knows where, from there to here. Right? So species niche. Understand the species niche. Then we have the community's niches, which is kind of the complement. It's like the same information from the previous slide, but looked at from the community's perspective. And it's like a job role. Okay, you've got butcher, baker, candlestick maker. Those are job roles. Those are community niches. They're community functions. And in order to have a healthy community, you've got to have a certain number of those different community niches filled for the community to function well. If there's no post office, right? There's threatening to close rural post office. No post office, is it going to be a healthy community? Maybe not. If there's no fire department, no police force, what's the deal? How's that going to work? How's the function of public safety going to be met in that community? You've got to have some niche filling element for those different needs, right? So in ecosystems, you're going to have a canopy tree, perhaps, a nut-producing canopy tree, but if you have a canopy tree, you're going to have canopy herbivores, guaranteed. Guaranteed you're going to have a canopy herbivore. Build it, they will come, for sure. So if you're going to have canopy herbivores, then you want to have canopy herbivore predators. And you'd like to have multiple species filling that niche of canopy herbivore predator. That's the principle of redundancy principle. Every need is met in more than one way, right? No one really snickered much when that little joke passed you by. So we'd like to have bacteria, birds, humans, insects, tree frogs, fungi, whatever, all as predators in the canopy so that we have a higher chance of getting a yield from that tree. Because if you only have bacteria and fungi and humans as predators, and you have a really dry year, the bacteria and the fungi may not survive in the canopy. And so the job of bacteria, the job of canopy herbivore predator falls to humans. And I don't want that job. Do you want that job? Is anyone here good at crawling around on branches, looking between leaf petioles and branches, looking for insects and eating them if you find them? If you're out there spraying chemicals of what organic or non-organic chemicals against pests in the canopy of your apple trees, you're acting as a canopy herbivore predator, whether you know it or not. And whenever you design a garden, you're designing a food web, whether you know it or not. So let's get good at it, folks. Let's get conscious. How do we design a food web? Let's figure it out. And the Holistic Orchard book that just came out by, and I'm totally blanking on the guy, Michael Phillips' book just came out. Awesome book, and he talks about how to do that in that book. All right? He lives not far from here, right? Further north. All right, so community niches. Now, when you have a whole set of species that are filling the same community niche, they're serving the same community function, that means that they are what we call a guild. All right? This is like a guild in the sense of the wheelwrights guild in the Middle Ages, where they all were wheelwrights, and they organized actually to limit competition from other people. Guilds are not actually the best word to be using, because they actually were a limit to the evolution of medieval culture for many, many years. But in any case, it's a word ecologists have used, and so it's a word I'm using. It's also a word that Bill Mollison of Permaculture fame used, and other people in permaculture use the word guild. But frankly, Bill Mollison and other people who use the word guild don't know what they're talking about. I'm shocked, actually, at how poorly framed the whole guild and polyculture idea is in permaculture, and I want to direct you to I don't want to be self-serving, but I'm directing you to my book, because I actually went to the ground in science and ecology and tried to figure out what the ecologists meant when they used the word guild. And they were actually confused, too, because they used the one word guild to describe 3 different kinds of relationships, and probably more, actually. So I have made a new term. So the first term is the community function guild. That's a set of species that are all serving the same community purpose, filling the same community niche. So all those canopy herbivore predators, bacteria, bird, insect, fungus, tree frog, human, that's one community function guild. Nitrogen-fixing plants, that's one community function guild. Right? Crops, that's one community function guild. Alright, so there's 3. In my book, I define 2 kinds of guilds. I now define 3 kinds of guilds. This is the 3rd one that's not in my book. Alright, my thinking has evolved, as Barack Obama might say. So let's look at a few community niches and some of the species that might fill them. So we've got crop plants. We've got these butternuts I talked about. These are incredible plants. Great tap-rooted, high-protein, high-omega-fat nuts. They store for a long period of time. There's natives and non-native species, varying hardness depending on the species and cultivar you use. They're huge trees, but they cast a medium to light shade, but they all give off a chemical called juglone. Black walnut gives off the most juglone, which inhibits the growth of other plants. It's called allelopathy. It's like chemical warfare, and it inhibits other plants from growing. So you've got to choose juglone-tolerant associates. Well, lucky for us, there's a number of those, which, unfortunately, you're in... What harness zone are we in right here? 4?
Barely 5.
Barely 5? Well, when it warms up a little more, you'll be able to grow this. Yeah, okay. Well, it'll be a while. It'll be 10 years or so. Anyway, this one tolerates juglone, persimmons, incredible fruit, but since you can't grow it here, I won't spend a lot of time on it. Hazelnuts also tolerate juglone. You can definitely grow those here. There's a bunch over at DAcres. The biggest challenge with hazels is Well, the eastern filbert blight is one, but the squirrels are the other. You have that experience? Are you getting nuts on yours yet?
Yeah, more the Jays.
The jays. Okay, jays, squirrels, yeah. Jays can move a lot of nuts in a very short period of time. They're very persistent and very smart. But there are people who contend that you could actually, jays are smart enough that you could actually domesticate them and train them to harvest for you. I think someone should try that. And your spare life? Yeah, exactly. Anyway, these have very high protein and oil. Some are up to 60% oil. And, you know, soybean oil is being grown for biofuel. But the soybeans that you grow for biofuel, you cannot eat the mash once you press the oil out of it. That's not true with hazels. If you get high oil content hazels, you can actually eat the mash still. So we could get a biofuel and a food from the same crop, potentially. There's a lot of research needed on that, too. Anyway, you want to grow the native species tend to have small nuts. The European cultivars have big nuts, but they're susceptible to the eastern filbert blight. So you're going to want to grow the cultivar, the hybrids. But they're a pretty amazing crop, and they also coppice. And there's a lot of work being done in the Midwest with these species. Try to develop commercial scale, huge, genetically diverse populations of hybrid that can be harvested mechanically, and they're trying to replace soybeans in the Midwest. Start growing soil around destroying soil with this crop. I talked about this one earlier. Don't need to talk about it more. It's a great vine, very vigorous. I will say, however, you can get 100 pounds of fruit on 100 square feet of trellis with this crop. And if you don't build a strong enough trellis, it will rip it off the side of your house. I have a friend that happened to. She built a wimpy trellis, and the plant just ripped it right off the house. So build a strong trellis. This one here, sea kale, is a great crop. You can grow this here. It's a beautiful ornamental plant on its own right, but it also has edible shoots, leaves, and broccolis. And it's deep tap-rooted, very drought-resistant. It's adapted to the coastal dunes of Europe. Okay, so it's pure sand, crappy soil. It'll do well, and it has these huge sprays of flowers. And I have to get a picture here, but it didn't flower. Creamy white flowers that give off a very strong honey scent that travels for many feet. So, like, what's not to love? You know, I guess if you don't like broccoli, you're stuck. But ramps, I talked about this a little bit earlier. The study done at Hubbard Brook Experiment Station, not far from here, where they were looking at yellow trout lily. It's a spring ephemeral like this. Comes up for a short time in the spring, then dies and goes dormant. Like this, yellow trout lily on a watershed scale, they found that the yellow trout lily stores for a short time and then re-releases large quantities of nutrients. They call it a vernal dam of nutrients because the amount of nutrients that the yellow trout lily soaks up and then releases again is equivalent to the amount that washes out of the watershed in the whole year. So the theory was that if there was no yellow trout lily in these watersheds, that the amount of nutrient loss from the watershed would double. Because they're sprouting, they're turning green and soaking those nutrients up in the spring. Snow melt, rainfall, decomposition of leaves over the wintertime, lots of available nutrients that could wash away. And they're soaking those nutrients up and holding them until the trees get active, and then when they die, the nutrients get re-released and don't get lost. So there's a good chance a lot of the edibles that are spring ephemerals are highly edible, highly considered tonic herbs, probably because my guess is because they're high in nutrients. Then we've got the gourmet decomposers, wine cap stropharia, great one, really easy to propagate, really easy to grow. A native species and tastes like it's been soaked in wine right off the stem. And then shiitakes, of course. This guy here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, is a 20 by 30 foot urban backyard, 800 shiitake logs. He's making tens of thousands of dollars a year growing shiitake mushrooms in his backyard. I talked about this species also, Blue Indigo, just to remind you. Nitrogen fixtures, dynamic accumulators. This is an edible dynamic accumulator. This one is called French sorrel. This is a cultivar called Perfusion, which never goes to flower. The species French sorrel, actually in a few weeks, it starts to go to seed, go to flower and seed, and it stops producing new leaves. This one never goes to flower, so that it produces leaves from April through October every year. It doesn't produce many in the summertime, but you can keep cutting and coming back, and it'll just keep going. And you plant it once, and you get sour greens. They are sour greens, but they're flavorful, mixed in a salad from April through October, year after year after year, and it'll grow in partial shade.
Great soup.
It makes great soup, and it dissolves very fast when you cook it. So if you try to use it as a green, just very light touch with steam, and it'll be a cooked green. But you don't want to cook it too long because it dissolves. But it'll also accumulate phosphorus, potassium, calcium, iron, and should you need morning diet sodium. And we have the nectar plants. I talked about the aster family. These are both aster family plants. The goldenrods are incredible plants for attracting beneficials. A lot of the beneficials that you attract, you actually can hardly see with your naked eye. They're very small, predatory insects that go after aphids and other insects. Really good things to have around. Asters, my observation is that asters tend to attract more bees and goldenrods tend to attract more wasps, but both are good to have around. Then comfrey, I talk about comfrey as a dynamic accumulator. Here's the minerals that it accumulates, but it's also a really good plant for food and shelter for beneficials. European studies, it's native in Eurasia. European studies indicate that it attracts a lot of lacewings, like to lay their eggs on the big fat hairy leaves of this thing. The parasitic wasps and spiders tend to hang out in the foliage for some reason unknown, but high numbers of those arachnids or arthropods. And then spider overwintering habit in all across Europe. All the plants they studied all across Europe, more spiders overwintered under comfrey than any other species they studied. 240 spiders per square meter in the soil underneath each comfrey plant. Right? Spiders are a generalist predator. They will eat whatever is most abundant in your garden, whether it's their beneficials or pests. But they're good to have because they help dampen out swings in population. You get an insect pest that's starting to grow its population, the spider's going to eat that more than other things because they're going to eat whatever's most abundant. And you want to have different kinds of spiders, the jumping spiders, the web spiders, all kinds of different spiders. These are good to have. Now, Russian comfrey is a cultivar. It's a hybrid. It's sterile. It does not spread by seed, supposedly. It will still spread by roots, however. The dwarf comfrey, Symphytum grandiflorum, and a cultivar called Hidcote Blue are 12 to 18 inches tall, much easier to handle in the garden. They're much more complementary with other plants. I love those two. They're beautiful flowers. And the Hidcote Blue is more of a runner, an open runner as a ground cover, and the dwarf comfrey species, the grandiflorum, is more of a spreading clumper. Really, and the grandiflorum as a spreading clumper is an incredible ground cover. It really holds ground well and outcompetes weeds very well.
Which one was the best? Which ones do you find most common in wild?
In the wild?
Yeah, because
Well, they're not native to this continent.
Okay, so which ones are there that you find in jars? I got them everywhere.
Most people in their yard, you're going to find probably the Symphytum officinale, not even the uplandicum, which is going to spread by seed and by roots.
Okay.
But don't till it because you'll make more of it.
Right.
Okay. Just warning you. And then ground covers. These are two of my favorite ground covers these days. This one is called prostrate, not prostate. Prostrate bird's foot trefoil. It's an inch tall. It's very dense foliage. Will not tolerate shade that well, but it'll tolerate foot traffic in your pathways. It's a nitrogen fixer. It's got some nice little yellow flowers, and it's a very dense ground cover that does do pretty good, pretty well keeping weeds down. And green and gold is a native specialist nectar plant. Flowers in the early summer, and mine's flowering now actually a little earlier this year than usual. Attracts beneficial insects. Semi-evergreen. Needs moist soil, though it does not do well in drought in my experience. All right, so that's some of the community function guilds that we might want in our garden, and some of the species that might fill them. It's 2 minutes to 9. You a little bit longer?
Yeah.
All right. 2 other kinds of guilds, and then we're going to wrap it up with the punchline. Okay? Resource partitioning guilds and mutual support guilds. Resource partitioning guilds are best exemplified with this image from John Weaver, who is one of the first planting ecologists. He's one of the planting ecologists that believed that ecosystems were like organisms. And he spent 4 years during World War I, while millions of men were digging trenches across Europe. He and a bunch of guys were out in the prairies digging trenches across the prairies for very different purpose. Because what they were doing was mapping the root systems of prairie plants. Over 4 years, they dug up and mapped the root systems of over 1,400 plants, individual plants, sometimes digging 20 feet deep into clay to map the root systems. Okay? And there's these intensive, if you can go to a library that has a good government document section, and they have the copy of these documents, you can look up in my book, the references in my book, and look at the original drawings. They're incredible drawings that are in the back of these books that he did. But what he found was that half of the native prairie plants had their main absorbing roots between 5 and 7 feet from the surface. A quarter had their main absorbing roots from 2 to 5 feet from the surface, and a quarter had their main absorbing roots in the top 2 feet of soil. And what he realized is they were partitioning a scarce resource, which was water. The prairies are an arid environment. The topsoil at that time was 7 feet deep. They weren't partitioning nutrients in the topsoil because they had 7 feet of topsoil. By the way, the average depth now is 6 inches of topsoil in the prairies, thanks to agriculture. They're partitioning water, and by partitioning that resource, that scarce resource, they're minimizing competition. It's also allowing greater diversity of plants. It also increases the productivity of the ecosystem because the plants that are shallow rooted are going dormant in the hot summertime because they don't have any water in those top 2 feet of soil. But they're green in the spring and the fall. And they've evolved to maximize their photosynthesis in cool, partly cloudy, rainy weather. Whereas the ones that have the deepest roots are green all summer, and they're designed to maximize their photosynthesis in the hot summer. They're C4 from the C3 photosynthesizers, if that means anything to you. And by having that spread of strategies, they get higher ecosystem productivity. More sunlight is converted into biomass every year. With less competition, more diversity, more redundancy in the ecosystem, more stability. Okay? Those are all desired properties that we want in our gardens. So if we want those desired properties, we'd be wise to mimic this by looking at what are the scarcest resources in our gardens: water, light, nutrients, and partitioning those scarce resources by design. You can do this with woody plants. Okay? At least theoretically. There's debate about this, but there's pretty well documented that there are different root patterns in woody plants. You've got tap-rooted plants like this, including my legs and torso. They all have roots near the surface because that's where the biology is. That's where the air is. That's where the nutrients mostly are. But the tap-rooted plants get water and nutrients from deep down here too. Right? Then you've got heart-rooted trees and shrubs which spread down and out from the crown, not like down and out, but they spread down and out. Right? Then you've got flat-rooted plants, ignore my torso and legs, they've got all their roots near the surface. And you can imagine if you only have flat-rooted plants, trees and shrubs in your garden, you're going to maximize competition. But if you mix it up, you'll reduce competition. This is why in the back of our volume 2 of my book, Eric and I did research on, we have 625 different plant species in the tables in the back of that book, and for about half of those we were able to find data on the root pattern of the plants. Very hard information to get and very hard to find. Okay? It's the biggest compilation of that data that I know of anywhere. And it's somewhat questionable, but it's what we got. So, chestnuts are tap-rooted. Right? All the areas that I know that have chestnut sprouts still coming up in the woods where chestnut used to grow, there's shadbush growing, Juneberry. All the Juneberries I have data for are flat-rooted. Tap-rooted, flat-rooted. A natural polyculture that was also a guild. A resource partitioning guild. They were also partitioning the light resource because this can flower even in partial shade, and it's an understory tree. So the canopy tree is a chestnut, sun-loving, shade-tolerant. They're partitioning the soil. They're partitioning the sunlight. Right? Then we have the mutual support guild, which is an example of the principle of multiple functions, of functional interconnection, excuse me. Functional interconnection, to remind you, is when the inherent needs of one element are met by the inherent products of another. When you have functional interconnection, you get this web of mutual support that builds stability and harmony and reduces stress, work, waste, and pollution. Okay, these are also qualities we want in our gardens. So we want to have these kind of guilds in our gardens. The best example I have of this comes from California. Did you know they grew grapes in California? Yeah, they actually make wine there. And what they found was that some vineyards in California have problems with this pest called the grape leafhopper. And if the grape leafhopper gets too abundant, it reduces the leaf area of the plant. They don't get very much grape production. But not all vineyards had big problems with this. Some had it, but not at economically harmful levels, and they asked some entomologists to figure out why. Well, it turns out that some vineyards had a large population of this wasp, which you can see that the background is a grape leaf in both of these cases. This is closer up, so this is a very tiny wasp compared to that tiny thing there. This parasitizes that, lays its eggs in it, and that increases the population of the wasp, Anagris epos. Well, why do some vineyards have this wasp in abundance and others don't? They did more research. It turns out that blackberries also have a leafhopper, and the Anagris epos feeds on the blackberry leafhoppers as well as the grape leafhoppers. But blackberries leaf out early in the season, and grapes leaf out late in the season. So the blackberry leafhoppers come out earlier, and that allows the Anagris epos to increase its population so they can control the grape leafhoppers. That's functional interconnection. The blackberry leafhoppers, and the wasp are all supporting the grape. And probably the grape leafhoppers are keeping the population of this wasp high enough through the fall so that the next year the blackberries are getting better control too. Right? So what goes around comes around. Now here's the kicker, folks. So that is a mutual support guild. That's a certain kind of relationship of functional interconnection as opposed to resource partitioning, as opposed to serving the same community function. Those are three kinds of guilds. This guild was able to operate even when the grapes and the blackberries were as far as 4 miles away from each other. It's not a polyculture. They're not in the same patch of ground. But they're still a guild. They're still functionally interconnected 4 miles away from each other. So this is one of my key points, folks. And this is where, Mollison and Toby Hemingway and other folks in the permaculture movement have kind of a bit off the rails with this, because they define a guild as a polyculture, a designed polyculture. But they're not grounded in the science. The science is saying this, what I just told you. These three kinds of guilds are what scientists in ecology talk about when they use the word guild. And they're all confused because they're all using the same word to describe three different relationships. But a polyculture is only when you have a number of species growing in the same patch of ground, living in the same space. That's what a polyculture is, whether it's designed by humans or not.